Well, I see a lot of people are still joining, but we're going to go ahead and get started, try to stay on time. Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this kickoff of our new quarterly webinar series hosted by the CUSP. My name is Kevin Ellett, and on behalf of the CUSP Outreach Working Group and the CUSP leadership team, we want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today. The goal of our new webinar series is to present on a quarterly basis some of the key updates that are impacting our region and really the nation as a whole in terms of CCUS, and then also to provide all of our stakeholders with an update on the various projects that the CUSP is supporting and other key projects throughout the region. And you're going to hear on one of those wonderful projects here later today in the webinar. Before we get started with the agenda here, I just have two quick announcements on some upcoming events. The first one is the annual stakeholders meeting of the MRCI, or Midwest Regional Carbon Initiative. That'll be hosted by Battelle in Columbus, Ohio on September 27th and 28th. So the MRCI is kind of the sister initiative of the CUSP for Midwest and Eastern US states. And many of us will be attending there, so it's nice to know what else is happening outside of the region, some good workshops and other things, so worth attending if you can. The second upcoming event is the annual CO2 conference held down in Midland, Texas. That'll be December 5th through 8th this year. And those conferences have focused historically on CO2 EOR. It's a full week of just amazing events that way, but also now additional focus towards CCUS in general and carbon management and all those kinds of things. So well worth attending if you can. And finally, if you have any events that you want us to be promoting through the CUSP or we need to know about, go ahead and use the Q&A feature here today. So that's a little button down at the bottom, as we all know. That's how we're going to field questions for the speakers today. But also go ahead and use that to send us any events that you think are important that we need to know about for the next quarter. And we'll go ahead and be able to announce those at the end of the webinar today. So now I want to turn it over to Jennifer Rainey. She serves as the co-lead of our outreach working group here in the CUSP, and Jen's going to introduce today's speakers.
Thanks, Kevin. And to follow up to the Q&A comment, in addition to any events that you'd like us to promote, please take notes today and any topics that you'd like us to cover more in depth in this webinar series. This is a way to reach out to you and all of other stakeholders. So any feedback that you get will be well received, and we'll take that in consideration when we schedule our future events. With that being said, I'm excited to be here and looking forward to announcing Robert Balch with New Mexico Tech, as well as Brian McPherson with the University of Utah. Bob, if you want to get started.
Great. Hopefully everybody can see that just fine. Thanks for setting this up, Kevin and Jen. So one thing that is a big impactor to the CUSP, of course, is the cost of carbon storage and how people can build infrastructure. Recently, there's been some changes to the 45Q tax credit. So I thought I'd take a little bit of time during this inaugural meeting to talk a little bit about the history of 45Q and where we are at with it right now, as well as a couple of the impacts that it can have on us and the regional initiatives. So without 45Q has actually been around for quite a while. It was limited, and a couple of big CO2 EOR projects used up most of the available credits prior to 2017. In 2017, there was a bipartisan law signed to adjust 45Q. They modified it again in 2021 to extend the deadline to start projects. And most recently, they modified it in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. And I'll talk about the details of these modifications as we go through, but I've also put in some of those changes in the slides as we will go through them. So what 45Q does is it provides tax credits for geologic storage of carbon oxides. Primarily CO2 is what we're worried about. Originally in 2017, that was set at $35 per ton for EOR projects or other uses of carbon. Now that's $60 per ton. Originally, it was $50 per ton for CO2 stored in other formations, so that would be your saline aquifers, basalt formations, etc. Now that is at $85 per ton. And direct air capture, which has become more of an topic of interest in the last couple of years, used to just fall under the other category. So it would have fell under the use of either EOR or pure storage and had that credit. Now there's a specific DAC credit of $180 per ton. So that's a substantial, these are substantial changes to the values of the credit. So 45Q is designed to jumpstart carbon storage projects in the US. I think that the genesis of this idea really goes all the way back into the early 2000s, where you're talking about clean coal. So how can you make coal clean? Well, you have to take the CO2 out of the equation. But more importantly, Department of Energy, I think, the US government for sure, other governments around the world, as well as major NGOs, people like EDF, believe that carbon storage is needed to address climate change. It's one of the pathways we can address to get to where people want to be in 2050, which is really only 27 years away. So there have been some efforts to make 45Q more effective. The initial rule, like many things that can come out of Congress, perhaps a little bit cumbersome, a little too specific in some areas, a little unspecific in other areas. In fact, it took the IRS more than a year to make their interpretation of what it meant for Treasury. But in 2020 and 2021, the Catch Act was proposed. The Catch Act would increase credits up to $85 per ton for saline storage and $60 per ton for EOR. Also eliminate or reduce thresholds for project size, and we'll cover some of these numbers later on. Also in 2021, 2022, the Access Act was proposed. That would make the tax credit directly payable. So one of the perceived flaws of the original 45Q was that you had to have a tax burden in order to be able to get the credit. Now, if you can make that a refundable tax credit, it makes it easier for people to finance or come up with the funds for building the infrastructure that's necessary for the carbon capture, transport, and storage. Also, the idea was to extend the credit by 10 years. So initially, you had until 2023 to get your project into the ground. And people perceived that was maybe not enough time to ramp up and make commercial projects viable. So there was actually a lot of broad bipartisan support for both of those bills. And I think that they would have passed independently last December. In fact, that was the original idea, that they would be put into their own law and voted on separately. Instead, that language was rolled into the Build Back Better bill, which failed to pass, if you remember back to December. So this language was also included in the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022, which did pass. So that has kind of broad ramifications for financing of carbon storage projects, not just for the CUSP, but for all the regional initiatives and anybody who has interest in the United States. So going back to the efforts to make 45Q more effective, the increase in the credits to $85 and $60 per ton, those were included in the IRA. Eliminate or reduce thresholds for project size, that was also included in the IRA. I'll give some numbers on those shortly. The Access Act also incorporated into the IRA. This was to make the tax credit directly payable. That was a very key component. Now anybody can get refundable credits for the first 5 years. The next 7 years of their tax credit eligibility, they would have to come up with a way to deal with the taxes. However, if you're a tax exempt organization, you can have that refundable tax credit for a full 12 years. We also extended the duration of the credit, the ability to access the credit by 10 years, so you can start your projects by 2033. There's something else that was thrown in that wasn't in either of the other proposed bills, and this is expanding transferability of your tax credits. So it used to be in the 2017 version that you could transfer the credit amongst your partners, operating partners in a project. So if you had a company that was doing the storage, one that was doing the transport, one that was doing the capture, you can move those credits around within that business structure. It looks like, and it's going to probably take a little bit of interpretation to really figure out exactly what this means, that any taxpayer can get these credits transferred to them. So you can sell them off to Enterprise Rent-A-Car or somebody like that who wants to use their credits for reducing their carbon footprint, I suppose. All right, so why should companies in general be interested in 45Q and carbon reduction in specific? And I know I said that backwards from the title. The economic benefits can be substantial. So a ton of CO2 is about 18 MMCF of gas, depending on pressure and temperature. There are places around the country where there are CO2 that's being emitted in large volumes. Some of those volumes are in very pure forms. For example, in the San Juan Basin in New Mexico, there's 4 gas separator plants. The largest of those are putting out 1 million tons per year of pure CO2 at atmospheric pressure. So under the 2022 rules, that could generate a tax credit of $50 to $85 million per year per plant if the CO2 were either used for EOR or some other purpose or stored. Other tangible benefits of reducing carbon emissions: your stored CO2 does not count as emissions for EPA or state reporting purposes, reduces your EGRIT report, reduces the CO2 footprint of your company, also reduces exposure to carbon taxes or emission penalties, which could be imposed later on by state or federal entities. I don't think that the EPA has been tracking greenhouse gas emissions. They're reported voluntarily initially. Now you're required to report them, but eventually there's going to be a penalty possibly associated with some of those emissions. The federal government has even intimated that they might put a carbon tax on production from federal lands, for example. So the other thing that it does for you is increases the sustainability of your operations. If you're an oil and gas producer in particular, could improve the public perception of your operations, especially if you work on the outreach, and reduce your economic risk from future regulatory or policy changes. So if next year a bill comes in that says there is a $20 per ton emission tax on CO2, it'd be nice if you're in the storage business and offsetting that already. So how do you access the 45Q? You install capture equipment at a facility to capture the CO2 streams. So for my example, in the San Juan Basin, you would need to add compression. To get the gas to about 1500 PSI, put it into a pipeline, you'd have to stub that either into the existing CO2 system or to a storage site. And that's an estimated cost of about $15 million just for the compression. So those are big numbers, and companies can be challenged by that. But when you look at the tax credits that are available, you can recoup that 3 or 4 times in just the first year of operation, especially with a refundable tax credit. You need to build a pipeline to transport the CO2 to a storage location. And you need to secure access to geologic storage or other takers of carbon dioxide. I think from a business standpoint, you need at least one, and preferably several places to put your CO2, because once you start to take a CO2 stream from a source, there's going to be a requirement that continues. And if you're in New Mexico, for example, or California or other states that have a Energy Transition Act, you may have a deadline where beyond that, you're not allowed to emit at all. So you better have more than one place to put your CO2. Existing CO2 pipelines, there's several thousand miles already in the US, can provide an additional outlet. And ultimately, as man-made sources of CO2 come online, I would imagine that the natural sources that are currently used for a number of EOR projects in the country, around 125 or so, would be offset. So maybe that sounds a little easy, but it's not. There's a lot of moving parts. You need permits, you need certifications, you need operational issues that are things that you contend with. The good news is these are things that the oil and gas industry in the US already knows how to do. And they have a lot of people that are trained to do these kind of things, with the exception of the permits. Those are kind of a new thing. So you need a couple of different kinds of permits. You need monitoring, reporting, and verification plans submitted to the EPA. You need injection permits, either in Class 6 or Class 2 wells. So the technology itself, though, is not really an issue. You have 50 plus years of EOR experience, 2 decades of intense Department of Energy sponsored projects on storing in the subsurface. You're already commercially storing at greater than 125 sites in the US. I know it's greater than that because that's about how many EOR sites there are, but there are also dozens of other storage sites that have been operated in the past, either as demonstration projects or are commercially operating today, like ADM in the Illinois Basin. And you can get significant economic benefits through 45Q, and those benefits are going to be partially disconnected from commodity prices. Price of natural gas or oil goes up or down, the value of your CO2 going into the ground stays the same. So this is what the form looked like. This is a couple years old. IRS is going to have to come up with a new form for the new limits in the rule, but it's really kind of a simple process. You have a single page, and basically you're being asked to check some boxes to see if you're eligible for the credit, and then put in some numbers to tell the IRS how much your credit is worth. So in the past, 2017, you would also need enough tax burden to utilize the non-refundable parts of the credit. It used to be 100% of it. Now you can get tax credit for the first 5 years or 12 years if you're a nonprofit. And the ability to form partnerships or even trade credits around, it looks like under the new version, makes this even more flexible. So really, it's these 3 elements that are important. You have qualified carbon dioxides. That's a carbon dioxide captured from an industrial source that would otherwise be released into the atmosphere. You must measure it at the source of capture and verify it at the point of disposal, injection, or use. Before 2017, the operations that already existed, there was a cap of 75 million tons for capture equipment that was installed earlier than that. That was basically consumed by some existing EOR projects. There's no cap on CO2 capture with equipment installed after the 2017 Act, and that continues with the 2022 Act. So the main thing is you have 12 years of credits after you start capturing and then injecting CO2. And originally you had to have those projects started by the end of 2023. Later that was modified to 2026, and now it's up to 2033. So there's ample time for companies to build up the infrastructure, capacity, business models, et cetera, to access these tax credits. You also need a qualified facility. So that's your industrial facility, the construction of which begins before January 1, originally in 2023, then 2026, now 2033. And the construction of carbon capture equipment before that date or the original planning and design of that facility includes carbon capture equipment. So there's some flexibility there on what counts as the shovel breaking the ground. Here's the other really important component of the 2022 language, and that is reducing the limits that you need. So it used to be the utilization project, that could be EOR or plastic or something else, that emitted at least less than 500,000 tons per year. They had to capture at least 25,000. Now these projects are subject to individual project thresholds, and I'm not sure exactly how that is going to play out, but I'm suspecting it's going to be on the order of the 1/8 or 1/10 limit that you're seeing in some of these other areas. We'll know more by January or so when the IRS releases the new interpretation. So electrical generating facilities used to have to capture at least 500,000 tons per year. That has been reduced to 18,750 tons per year. So basically this takes your capture from the larger gas-fired coal plants and larger coal-fired power plants being the only thing that was eligible in the electrical generating, down to a number of much smaller things, power switching, on and off gas turbines that are used for peak power, et cetera, now may start to meet these goals. because they only need 18,750 tons per year. Other facilities, which is almost everything else that we deal with, particularly in oil and gas and in most storage projects, used to have to capture at least 100,000 tons per year, and now that's 12,500. So 1/8 of the previous limit. And then the addition of the direct air capture language, they would have fallen under the 100,000 tons per year in the other category before. Now those only need 1,000 tons per year. So essentially, with that language change, you have created an environment where people can start to build things small and then scale them up instead of immediately going to a very large scale before they can access the credit. So the third component, and the one that's very near and dear to the hearts of the CUSP team members, is secure geologic storage. This includes storage in deep saline formations, oil and gas reservoirs, unminable coal seams, basalts, etc. Any place that takes it out of the atmosphere for around 1,000 years or so. To do this, you need a storage site that has approval by the EPA of a monitoring, reporting, and verification plan. And that's to be submitted by the operator of that storage site. I think Matt will talk a little bit about that during the lucid/target part of this presentation. The amounts of your applied for credit on their tax form better align with your greenhouse gas reporting quantities. They're probably going to check that as part of the audit. And in the case of EOR, only new CO2 brought to the site, not recycled gas, qualifies for the credit. So EOR has been doing this for a very long time, more than 5 decades. It's really the basis for all carbon storage research. That's where it began. And you have a lot of data for how CO2 goes into oil reservoirs. And you have cumulative storage across the country at gigaton scales, which is what we need to be getting to. So in a sense, some of this has already been done. It's just a matter of shifting priorities. You had the regional carbon storage partnerships started in 2003. The US DOE established the regional partnership program to understand regional and national storage potential, technologies, and perform demonstration projects. We also basically wrote the best practices manual on how to set up things like monitoring plans that you need for the new tax credits. We also have the Carbon Safe program, which is looking at commercialization of larger scale capture facilities. So those are your 15 to 15 plus million tons over longer periods of time. And then the new regional partnership program, of which the CUSP is one of the members, is Congress telling DOE and DOE agreeing that they need to double down and continue the work of those regional carbon storage partnerships. So this is what we have for the regional initiatives. You have the CUSP, we're in the Southwest and the Western US. You have PCOR out of North Dakota, covering the Northern Great Plains. MRSCP, Battelle, merged with Illinois Basin Decatur Project, and they cover the Midwest and Northeast. And then you have CCARB in the Southeast. The programmatic goals of the regional initiatives: accelerate onshore CCUS technology deployment in the US, coordinate capabilities and experience. A lot of the people that were in those original 7 regional carbon storage partnerships are now in the regional initiatives. Address key technical challenges, facilitate data collection, evaluate regional infrastructure, and promote regional technology transfer. And that's really what we've been doing. And I think the bottom line for us is that these regional initiatives are the resource that will get these programs off the ground commercially. Maybe in 10 years we're not needed, but right now we're perhaps the best place to go to for help on these kind of projects. All right, so, and just a little tag for CUSP. We have 15 projects in the CUSP region. These are partially or fully funded by Department of Energy funds. 3 of those were started in 2021. 2 of those ones are completed, and we have 12 that are active, or 13 that are active right now. And I will stop there. Is this where you tell me I was on mute the whole time?
No, not at all. Thank you, Bob, for that. I appreciate it. We got a few questions in the chat. First one relates to EOR, and you did cover it. That's also included in the credits. One of them from an anonymous attendee said that you mentioned that the IRS is going to issue updated rules or guidance in January 2023. How firm is this timing, and is this based on information provided by the IRS?
It's kind of based on the history of what they did before. I have no control over Treasury, and they are very distinct from the people that we normally work with at EPA or with the Department of Energy. So they're going to have to come up with a new tax form. They may or may not revisit their interpretation of the guidance. I think that there may be a little bit of a Gordian knot that they need to unravel with the transferability of credits. I don't know how long that might take them. I don't know if they will address it or how they will address it. I don't speak for the IRS. I try and avoid the IRS.
Except in April when it's due, right? That's great. That's very helpful. Another question we got about is, do you have any thoughts on prevailing wage, apprenticeship, and domestic content? This is from Eric Rosenfield.
So I'm going to have to interpret what that question means, but I think it's having to do with what's going to cost to do these projects. What are the people that are doing them going to be getting paid? I suspect it's going to be on the order of what oil workers are paid right now. It's a lot of the same skill sets, a lot of the same people, and they uniformly have some of the best wages in the country. So this is a great chance for them to repurpose their careers, but also younger people that are coming in also to learn skills that will be applicable for the next few decades while carbon storage carries the load of minimizing climate change.
That's excellent. Thank you. And workforce development is something that's also important to us here in Kansas. A lot of the folks in the oil patch are finding a hard time getting workers and people to come support them. So with working through the university and a group such as CUSP, it's a really great way to identify and meet the needs and the people who are looking for these individuals. So thank you for that.
Some of one of the slides, I think you're going to make them available on the CUSP website.
I believe so. Yes, at cuspwest.org. We'll put the URL in the chat, Kevin, if you wanted to do that. We will make these slides available after the fact. We'll post them to our website. So please check that out there.
Yeah, and we'll also post the recording of this meeting too. So you'll be able to access that through there. One other quick question before we go, Bob. Do we have any examples of what it takes to meet this start of construction requirement? So obviously shifting off to 2033 really helps a lot of folks who are just trying to pull these things together. But you can imagine even as we get to that point, there would still be, people trying to get financing, other things to make these projects happen. I've heard all kinds of things like, well, just, sticking a bolt in the ground would qualify. Do you know of any real examples where people will understand what it does take to meet that qualification?
The original concern was there was a few years to get your project started. This deadline of 2023, end of 2023, initially. So IRS interpreted that as if you have a plan to build a carbon capture facility, but you haven't built that particular unit, but you've built other components of the project, that counts as having it started in time. So with the extension of the start date by 10 years all the way up to 2033 from now, I mean, you have plenty of time to get your shovels in the ground. I think that's not the issue that it used to be.
Great, thanks for clarifying that. So back to Jen for our next round.
Well, we do have a couple more quick questions. I don't know if we have time. What do you think, Kevin? Or should we move on?
We could do another minute. Sure.
Let's do the first one that comes in. Bob, can you speak to the impact of Section 48 investment tax credits on CCUS or CCS?
So this is where it gets kind of tricky, right? So I really don't know how this is going to work, but I'm thinking of, I rent a car from Enterprise or I take a flight on American Airlines or something like that. You can check a box. I'm gonna buy a carbon offset, right? So I'm thinking that some of these companies will be able to buy into your tax credits and then reuse them for that purpose or do something else with them. So an investment purpose, it's hard to say. Maybe you get a big group of investors that want to buy into DAC projects. So an example of that would be like real estate consortiums. People can buy not real estate, but they can buy shares of a company that develops real estate. So it could be the same kind of a thing. where there's some profit that's realized from like a DAC operation that pays dividends back. I think that that's the sort of thing that is now technically allowed. How that works in reality is a mystery for the IRS to unravel.
Thank you, Bob. All right, I guess we'll move on to the next section. Kevin, would you like to do the next introduction?
Yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce Matt Eels, now at Targa Resources. And Matt has a great example of one of these featured projects that Bob mentioned. We've got over a dozen projects that the CUSP is supporting. And their project was one of the early ones. And he's going to speak about where they're at with the project and also how the CUSP supported them to get to that point. Please take it over, Matt.
Very good. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Very good. Yeah, so just to introduce myself, as mentioned earlier, I'm with Lucid and now part of a larger company by the name of Targa Resources that acquired Lucid about 1 month ago. Our assets have sat in Southeast New Mexico. And the next slide over, I'll get into more detail, but I wanted to highlight right here what a natural gas processing plant looks like from a distance on the ground. And the very fact that natural gas processing business, the whole purpose of it has been historically to remove CO2, H2S, and other what's called impurities from the natural gas that's coming up from downhole with upstream clients of ours and around the world. So like Bob said earlier, a lot of what we've done for many years, and that has included sequestering CO2 riding along with H2S. To back up a notch and introduce myself, again, Matt Eels. I have a master's in environmental engineering from University of Kansas. Kind of accidentally fell into the oil field in 1997 at a cable manufacturing plant in Lawrence that manufactures power cable for submersible oil pumps. Schlumberger Oilfield Services acquired that company and had the opportunity to go around the world and implement some environmental health, safety management systems in pretty much every corner of the world through Schlumberger and all their services. Changed gears, went to Chesapeake Energy in Oklahoma City, first foray into upstream, and then part of a startup called American Energy Partners that Aubrey McClendon started up when he left Chesapeake. I've only been with midstream now for coming up on 4 years. And I can even say myself, I really did not understand the complexities of what midstream does and how that CO2 had been sequestered for so many years as part of their processing services. So if you don't mind, change it to the next slide. So this overview, again, is a Lucid overview. It's a couple, 3 months dated, but it does show all the things that I wanted to go through. If you just looking at the map on the top right, the asset overview, what you'll typically see with a midstream company is that they are tying in pipes, and these are two separate assets that we have managed. One in the top left, one in the bottom right. And those are bringing in gas from oil and gas wells, coming in from, as you'll see on the slide, majors like XTO, Exxon, Occidental, Mewbourne, Chevron, Centennial, and growing. And so they will bring their oil to the surface. The oil typically will go to tanks that gets hauled off by trucks. And the gas, many years ago was seen as a low value product, and a lot of times it was flared. Over the last decades, it's become more and more valuable, and also the environmental regulations have required that to tie in on an oil well, you have to find a purpose for the gas, which has been great, of course, for the midstream industry because we process that gas. The state of New Mexico in particular has made flaring illegal. You have to have very good reasons to do it. And if you do, you have to report every bit that you do flare, again, resulting in bringing more gas to midstream companies like ours. So on the left side, you'll see some of the bullet points and then the graphical growth. In Southeast New Mexico alone, we're actually currently at 1.3 billion cubic foot of natural gas processed a day. And again, those are all coming from local wells in the Southeast New Mexico area. That gas comes up from the ground, highly saturated with water, sometimes from sour fields with H2S inside of that, which is very dangerous to the life and health of our employees, as well as the communities around us. Or you'll have sweet gas, which will be CO2 without H2S and water, or it will have water, but no H2S. What we do in our processing, if you switch to the next slide, you can see an image of the Red Hills complex. This sits 20 miles west of Jal, New Mexico. And what you'll see in these pictures with the dots are what we call trains. So you'll see a Red Hills 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're actually building one next to the 5 now. And then the AGI in the distance has the number 6, but that's our AGI well. So what we do in this picture is on the far right, you'll see several lines of pipe that are stacked up. The gas comes into the plant from 34 compressor stations that we operate and manage all around southeast New Mexico. We bring the gas to this plant. It comes into the right side, again on the inlets, and liquids that are entrained are separated at that point, and you can get your NGL liquids that range from propanes, ethane, other heavies, and those are sold and separated separately. Water is separated with triethylene glycol systems, and amine is used to capture the CO2 and the H2S that come in. And again, historically, that amine will capture CO2, H2S, and on a sweet system, on the sour system. So the sour system will come in at the very top in the number 1 and 2. And again, that's H2S CO2. It is separated and injected into our acid gas injection well, AGI well, at that top left corner with the number 6. And I'll show you a close-up later on. That acid gas injection well, again, its primary purpose has been to put the H2S back into the formations and keep it from getting emitted into the atmosphere, where it is a very dangerous irritant that can damage lungs quickly. So all states have regulations on this, and where sour gas is found, AGI wells have been the solution to put away both the H2S and the CO2. Again, historically, the CO2 was a rider. If you look to the forefront of this plant, our sweet system is more up on 4 and number 5. So there's no H2S in that gas. Amine is also used there, and the amine strips out the CO2 and then vents the CO2 because it's not toxic to the environment, and there's not a permitted reason to not emit that CO2. So this is where the real opportunity lies for us and other companies. With CO2 now having a value associated with it, the plant amine and also our field amine units on the sweet system are able to capture that CO2, and rather than vent, we can invest more money in more electricity, larger pipes, larger compressions to move that CO2 from the field locations, which previously would have stripped it at that location, bring it to the plant, process it, and then inject it into additional AGI wells. So we permitted a second well. We're drilling that well within 2 months. Should be done spring of next year. And we are in the process of permitting an AGI 3 well and additional wells. Because again, the great benefit here is that we have the CO2, it's coming from downhole. We keep that in the pipe, don't release it to the atmosphere, separate the methane, the natural gas that then goes to sale and goes to California, the Waha hub, to Texas, and is either sold to power plants to produce electricity, or is sold to transmission lines that bring it to everyone's homes to heat our homes. But these waste products go to our class 2 well right here in the picture. So if you go to the next slide, what you'll see here is more of a close-up of the AGI processing facility. So the equipment in the foreground is specifically set up to separate and compress H2S and CO2 gas. Our composition is about 3% H2S, 97% CO2. This material is typically all stainless. Both are highly corrosive, and we'll compress the gas and push it over to the well in the far top right portion of this picture. And if there's any upset condition, emergency condition, it will kick to the flare on the northwest corner to burn the H2S, converting it to SO2, which is one of the criteria pollutants, but less toxic to the environment and to human health than H2S. You don't want it to go to the flare, but you always need to have that backup in case something were to go wrong with the process. Again, on the bullets on the left, you will see that we bringing in CO2, our amine treatment systems are in the field and at the plant, and about 50% of our emissions come from those amine treatment systems. Our footprint on an annual basis at the Red Hills plant has been about 500,000 tons of CO2 released through the amine systems. We're currently injecting 35,000 tons that ride along with the H2S. And again, it's a great opportunity for us to expand more AGI wells with the predominant purpose being the CO2, but also backup for H2S. And what we found in the process and working with the CUSP, and I continue to see this within Targa and within other midstream companies, is, as Bob highlighted earlier, we have the experience and the engineering expertise to separate, process natural gas, send the gas on, separate out the NGLs, separate the waste gases, and to inject it downhole. We have the subsurface knowledge to a limited amount within midstream, but we know who to work with within the upstream side that are more comfortable in drilling wells for disposal to make it all happen together. What we don't have is the knowledge of the policy and the deeper understanding of how the CCS rules lay out, how the 45Q rules lay out in their ever-changing conditions that they're in, and also the downhole formation modeling. So again, we can hire out a third party to drill the well, but before even being allowed to drill the well, we have to go to our state regulators to seek approval for that injection of that fluid. And it's a supercritical combination of CO2 and H2S. That's not something that midstream companies have an expertise in. So working with the CUSP, we've been able to identify and work with some extremely knowledgeable people that know how to do the best possible subsurface modeling with the latest software, and really give assurance to ourselves and the regulators that our plans are quality, that the CO2 will stay in the formation, and that we're doing everything environmentally correct. So that knowledge has been great. We can provide the flows to the well, but then that modeling subsurface is great. The other thing that we found was just a wonderful relationship with the Subpart RR department manager on the greenhouse gas division of the EPA. The CUSP had open doors to reach out and ask some questions that we had, and in the interpretation between a class 2 and class 6 and what's applicable or not. Without the CUSP, we had found a number of people that proclaimed to be experts in carbon capture, but they were absolutely committed to class 6 was the only way to go. But again, the relationship that with multiple universities the CUSP has with the greenhouse gas division, we were able to have some direct phone calls with them and follow-up emails where they confirm that as long as you meet the Subpart RR requirements and your wells are robust to meet those requirements and modeling performed properly, and then the MRV plan built out appropriately, that you would meet that. So we did spend about a year and a half or a year in development of the MRV, about a half of a year in getting this to the EPA for their review and their approval of our MRV plan. And then kind of the last little bit working with EPA and also some conversations with DOE, we were able to get that final approval December of last year. So since then, our well that you see in this picture is part of the EGRIT program. Our MRV plan is attached to our EGRIT account. And again, we're showing 35,000 tons, which prior to this year was below the threshold, and now it's above that 12,500 threshold that Bob mentioned earlier. So with that said, I'll stand for any questions.
That was great. Thank you, Matt. Just to start out on where you finished off here in terms of subpart RR and qualifying, that's all just related to your existing well now, right? So that's permitted as a class 2 well. And that was kind of the game changer with your project in terms of other folks looking at class 6 and that whole process, but you were able to figure out how to do it with class 2. You mentioned also the next well I think you wanted to drill, you were talking about ultimately that would allow you to inject up to around 500,000 tons per year. Is that correct?
That one, I think, can't remember the total tonnage, but it's around 250,000 tons.
Okay, so still
we have 500,000 tons emitting, and that next well will get us there, but not all of it.
okay. So maybe even some more work after that.
Yep.
For the next well, how much additional work goes into MRV on that side, or is it already covered under the work that you did?
Yeah, it's the latter, and that's a very good question. AGI 1 and the future AGI 2 were included in our MRV proposal. What we were advised when we had the call with the Greenhouse Gas Division was to follow the LaBarge facility in Wyoming in the model that they employed, which was the same. So when we submitted our MRV, it included an existing AGI number 1 and a pending number 2. And we provided the details of what that design and construction would look like when we were done. Also, we had a commitment that once we were done with number 2 and we were injecting, we would update the MRV with all details that we had on that AGI 2 for a resubmittal, so that they could then verify that everything we had completed met our intent on the first MRV plan.
Excellent. I'm looking on our chat, our Q&A right now. Looks like we're caught up with questions. But I think this is really nice to just kind of emphasize, the whole goal of the CUSP, the other 3 regional partnerships. I mean, we're all established and supported by Department of Energy to help make these projects happen. And there's a whole lot of flavors and Matt, you're pointing out the expertise that the CUSP was able to bring in terms of subsurface modeling and how that really helped you guys move forward. So I think for the audience today, we just really want to point out that, as we go through these webinars, and again, part of the point of the webinars is to keep us engaged with the broader stakeholder community. We don't want to wait until a single annual meeting once a year. We conducted ours back in June, and we want, things are moving so rapidly that we want to keep that engagement going and be a resource for anyone in the Western US who's interested in doing this. So, I think that's the main goal that we want to emphasize here. And we really appreciate you talking about your experience on this webinar. And I think our one next quarter, we may even expand to more of a 2-hour webinar to really hit on several of these projects and make it more clear for folks about how they can use the CUSP as a resource to try to help move their projects along. As I said all that, we do have some new questions coming in, so that's fantastic.
Would you like me to rattle them off? Oh, you got them. Go ahead.
Yeah, first one here is, what was the total time waiting on EPA for MRV? Sounded like it was 6 months, but then this additional time as well.
Total time was around 8 months, and Bob can correct me if I'm wrong. It was about 8 months time period with 2 requests for revisions and, updating, modifying based upon their feedback. So 8 months to 10 months.
I think we submitted late April, early May, and it was approved mid-December. So yeah, 7-8 months or so for the EPA to do their review. One thing that made the Lucid project such a an appealing early target was because of the permitting process for the AGI injection with the state of New Mexico. There's already a very large set of data and analyses of the geology, the area of review that would be needed, all kinds of things that you also need for that MRV was sort of available, and we could work that into our modeling and save some time. So there was probably about 3 months of really intense work leading up to that submission on a more of a greenfield type project. Might be 5 or 6 months of lead up. So I think we can show that in most cases you should be able to do one of these within a year. And if you already have a lot of your data, you can do it in 6 months.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd also like to add is the importance for us and for the OCD or any regulatory body to ensure that we were always meeting the intent of our commitments on our Class 2 permit. Through that process, we communicated what we were using that well for, how it would be used, how we would look for any loss predominantly of H2S. And we had to make sure that we, previously and all time in the future, we stay true to our commitments within that order. And we do that, that by following the order requirements and putting away the H2S and CO2, we're 100% in compliance with that Class 2 order. But now the real difference is we're able to quantify and submit to the EPA how much CO2 is going downhole with that H2S.
We also have a technical question from Dr. Maohong Fan, who's part of the CUSP partnership out of Wyoming. He asks, what is your targeted H2S ppm level after your H2S separation process?
That's a good question. I don't know that offhand. It's exceptionally low, but I don't know what that answer is. I tend to believe that the target is 0 as far as ppm, because that flare is only there for an emergency situation. It's not burning off any H2S on a continuous basis. That said, I don't think you can ever get to 0, so that's a good question.
Maybe it's a ppb instead of a ppm.
Yeah, it's likely in the ppb. I'll get that answer from smarter people than me.
Well, that's helpful for folks like Maohong who are working on some of those very fine details like that.
You're getting from the panelists and from Raven, Matt, if you read the Q&A.
Specified in the order. Okay.
Yeah, but I think that the theoretical target would be 0, but there's probably some limit that's allowable. I can't remember either, even though I signed the order.
Okay, we have another question. This may be too business sensitive here, but I'll go ahead and pitch it to you and feel free to punt if you like. An anonymous attendee asked, how did this AGI well influence the buyer of your assets earlier this year?
Yeah, I think I can answer that question in a relatively publicly known kind of an answer, and that is that we saw this, as Lucid Energy, we were a private equity company with Goldman Sachs and Riverstone, and you guys would see the news, and it's absolutely factual. The BlackRock's, Goldman's, Riverstone investors are seeking more and more ESG friendly companies for investments. They see that there are a number of new investors now that want to know that what they are investing in is following a great ESG program. And so being able to sequester CO2, I would say from my experience during that time, it was more of a driver of having a green investment or doing the right thing. Like perfect example is this: the midstream operation. It gets lumped in with oil and gas, and oil and gas has a number of facets. But being able to try to communicate in layman's terms how we are part of capturing methane, getting it to market, and then putting away CO2 was very important to them. So I would say I definitely can't answer, how that drove Targa, but I can say that within the Lucid entity, we all were very aware that this was very important to investors around the world, and it was going that way.
Yeah, and I think many of us have seen that. And as you say, it's a global thing. It's not just the U.S. investment community. I mean,
I would say on the other side, the CO2 value as far as 45Q, it's still a little bit of an unknown. The regulatory uncertainty that still resides in place doesn't make it, something that investors see as, something as much of a no-brainer as the ESG side. It's of interest, but it's just not a certainty at this point.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be true until we have more and more of these projects, right? Over the next few years, prove it out, and then it's going to be hopefully take off from there. One final question here, again from Anonymous. They asked, so could anyone with an AGI well potentially qualify then? I think that would go back to how much CO2 you have as well.
The potential there, one of the differentiators that Dr. Balchus told me about, and I've seen it, is some states have more restrictive requirements for a Class 2 well than other states, and so at least in the state of New Mexico, the requirements are very stringent, and with ours, we were able to prove out that what we had permitted, drilled, and completed and operated as a Class 2 well met the requirements.
Yeah, so that goes back to your earlier point where there's still a lot of uncertainty, some risk there, and so much of this comes down to state by state to really figure out what's going to work. Okay, well, I think we finished up with the questions. Thank you again to Matt and also to Bob for these presentations. Fantastic, great kickoff for us. No one threw in any surprise events that we need to be aware of this coming quarter. So remember those two that I mentioned, and on our CUSP website where I sent the URL, we are updating an events calendar within there. So as we hear more over the coming months, come and check on our website every once in a while. We will have posting those events and things related to those. So that'll be useful as well. It looks like Brian might want to say something here to finish us off.
Just fabulous. I actually learned a lot today, which it's been such a busy week that it's difficult to soak up information, but there's some really good information conveyed today, and just I'll echo thanks to both Matt and Bob.
Great. Well, with that, we will adjourn for this webinar, and thanks again for everybody joining, and stay tuned next quarter, probably mid-December. We'll be at it again with many more featured projects like Matt presented today. So we'll see you all then.
Thank you.